Welcome to the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast, episode number 53. Everybody wants to be great until it's time to do what greatness requires. Anonymous.
Broadcasting from a dark, windowless room in Hollywood when we really should be working on that next draft.
It's the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast,
Showing you the craft and business of screenwriting while teaching you how to make your screenplay bulletproof. And here's your host, Alex Ferrari.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast. I am your humble host, Alex Ferrari. Now, today's show is sponsored by Bulletproof Script Coverage. Now, unlike other script coverage services, Bulletproof Script Coverage actually focuses on the kind of project you are and the goals of the project you are. So we actually break it down by three categories: micro budget, indie film market, and studio film. There's no reason to get coverage from a reader that's used to reading tentpole movies when your movie is going to be done for $100,000. And we wanted to focus on that at Bulletproof Script Coverage. Our readers have worked with Marvel Studios, CAA, WME, NBC, HBO, Disney, Scott Free, Warner Brothers, The Blacklist, and many, many more. So if you need your screenplay or TV script covered by professional readers, head on over to covermyscreenplay.com. Now, today on the show, we have author Jennifer Dornbush, and she has written the book Forensic Speak: How to Write Realistic Crime Dramas. And this book really unlocks the secrets of forensic science for screenwriters. And she is an expert in all things forensics, and her story on how she was raised by a dad who was a coroner, and she was kind of playing with body parts when she was a kid and all sorts of incredible things. But she has written the definitive book on forensics, dialogue and talk and terms, and she has consulted on major movies and TV shows, helping them bring realistic dialogue and realistic situations to crime scene investigators and anything having to do with a dead body or murder or things like that. Let's just put it that way. But it's something that really I've never really heard of before, and I think it's something that a lot of screenwriters who are writing crime features or television shows or procedural cop shows or things like that, detective stories, all those kind of stories really could benefit from it. So that's why I invited her on the show. So we could really talk forensic speak. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jennifer Dornbush. I'd like to welcome to the show Jennifer Dornbush. How are you doing, Jennifer?
Very well today. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much. You are the first author I've had. We're going to talk all things forensics, and it is a niche of a niche of a niche, and it's actually really important considering the popularity of crime dramas and crime feature films and TV shows. Geez, TV shows! Can you imagine?
TV shows, there's so many.
Oh man, and I mean, just on Law and Order alone, I think there's 3 lifetimes we would have to live to watch all of the Law and Orders, every episode of every series.
Don't even get me started on the NCIS.
NCIS, CSIs. I mean, forget it. Like multiple lifetimes. We'll have to get reincarnated many times to come back to watch all of those shows. So I want to have you on the show because I think it's something that nobody really does talk about very often. I guess that's one of the reasons why you wrote your book. And it is something that I've seen in scripts that I've read and TV shows I've seen. They're like, "Ooh, that it doesn't sound good." Even someone someone like myself who's not an expert, but I've watched a lot of those shows over the years, that you start to pick up certain rhythms in the dialogue and certain rhythms in, well, that doesn't make any sense. That DNA situation's not working. They're like, you can't get DNA from that, can you? So we're going to get into all of that. But before we get started, how did you get into the business in the first place?
The business of film and television?
Actually, both. I would love to know. I like to know forensics and film and television. And then how did you bring the two together?
Yes, they do have a merging story.
Okay.
So I will start with forensics. I was born into it. I was born into the world of forensics, so I had no choice.
So you were born in a murder scene. Got it.
Exactly. That would make a good story.
That would actually make a really good story.
My father was a medical examiner for 3 counties in northern Michigan, and the office was in our house.
Oh.
So Yes.
Literally.
So literally, the autopsies were done at the hospital, but everything else came to our house. Tissue samples, blood samples, files, detectives, victims, families, morticians, always knocking on our door. Video, there were always like a set of there's always like a death certificate on the kitchen table next to the, casserole or whatever. Or pictures from the latest, investigation. And my mom would be like, can you move those? Can you get those off the table? It's dinner time now. So
Right.
I did my first case when I was 8, my first death investigation. And I grew up around it. So I didn't think it was weird until I became a teenager. And then you get kind of self-conscious and you're like, wait, nobody else's dad does this? Like, you guys don't have like livers in your freezer? I don't get it. Any human livers.
Yes.
It sounds very like Hannibal Lecter.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very interesting because my father's very scientific and he's also very much a teacher. And so everything was a lesson. Everything was a lesson in anatomy, biology, life. And my mother, she worked the business. She was sort of the bookkeeper, the office manager, kept track of all the records. When people came to the house looking for a death certificate, she would talk to them and give them what they needed. So it was just how I lived. So when I grew up and went off to college and tried to figure out what am I going to do with my life, I always knew, kind of running away from the dead bodies, I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. And it took me a while to kind of figure out the path. I did journalism, I did public relations, I did a lot of different things with my writing until I finally was like, the thing I really want to do is write for the masses. And so I started to take screenwriting classes, started to learn film and television writing. And as you know, when you start to become a creative person, especially a writer, a content creator, whatever that is, director, producer, you're like, what is it I have to bring to the world? Like, what do I want to talk about? What do I know about? What makes me different in my storytelling? Excuse me. That is going to kind of make me stand out because, as you know, Hollywood is ultra competitive and it's not enough to be a good writer. You have to have that thing that makes you stand out. And I really did not put this together, my background and my writing, for a very long time. And so other people were kind of starting to point it out. And they're like, Jennifer, you kind of had this proclivity for writing about mystery and crime. And like, you seem to know a lot about this forensic world. Why is that? And I literally it was other people who said this to me. And then I'm like, oh, I've kind of taken for granted that I have this whole wealth of knowledge about death investigation and forensics and how things work in police investigations that most people don't know.
Right.
But I really did not put it together for a very long time. And then I decided to go back to school to get some more forensic training because I realized that I kind of liked it a lot. I kind of missed it. I love science. I love that world. And so much changes in forensics all the time. There's always new things developing. I mean, DNA science alone is an ever emerging science. So I went back to school, got some training in forensic science so that I could actually build from the platform that I had. And that's kind of how it all landed. That's how it all came together. So.
Yeah, we're always the last to realize what we're good at. Isn't that the truth? I literally sat when I was 18 in my room going, what am I going to do with my life? And I looked around, I had 3,000 VHSs of movies from my video store walking around. And I looked around, I'm like, I guess I like movies. Maybe I should be a director. And that was pretty much the road I went down.
I know it's funny, because we just live it. We don't think about it,
Right, exactly. But that's a very unique story. Like, you literally were born into it. Other than being born at a murder scene, you're the next best thing is literally being around it the entire time. It's pretty amazing. Now, you've also consulted on a bunch of shows, haven't you? What kind of shows have you consulted and what have you consulted with them on, if you could talk about?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So out of that experience of going back to school, I wrote this book, Forensic Speak, which is basically like a forensic boot camp in a book, because I couldn't find anything that really kind of compiled all that forensic knowledge into a really easy, fast, understandable, authentic, comprehensive, other than a textbook. Who's going to read a textbook? And because of this book, I started to get speaking engagements, and then people started to find me. And I guess it was really just word of mouth, because I really didn't advertise it. And then I would get calls or emails from like assistants on shows like Hawaii 5-0 or Rectify, Leverage, Conviction, Bull, just along the way, just these kinds of social. And they would just have kind of random questions mostly about like, if a person died this way, is that plausible? Or if we do this, what kind of evidence can we get off that body? So, yeah.
And that must have been exciting, starting to get those kind of calls.
Yeah. I love it because I love to research. And so if I didn't know the answer, I got a chance to learn something new. So
can you give a definition of what is forensic speak?
Yes. So forensic speak is basically, how do you speak forensics? There is an authenticity to the language of DNA, crime scene investigation, death investigation, what happens in a courtroom, fingerprint investigation. There's a whole language to that. And so not just the science behind it, the book is about the science behind it, but it's also like, what does it mean? So I break it down into sections, chapters that breaks all the like fingerprint science, DNA science. How do you investigate a crime scene? What is a buccal swab? What is mitochondrial DNA? And how can you use it in your writing or in your content creating?
It's funny because I actually remember very vividly when I first got to LA almost over a decade ago. I went to the California Science Museum, and they had a CSI exhibit.
Cool.
At there, like from the show.
Cool.
And I got to walk in, and we go through 3 murder scenes, and so and literally you go in and start playing the game of like, what's the blood splatter? How is blood splatter actually done? Like, how is it really? How do you, by the blood splatter, you can tell if how the body was hit or how the injury happened. Or you probably can explain blood splatters much better than I can, but it was kind of so fascinating to go in through all of that. And there was an autopsy table. It was like insane stuff. So It was, I know you're like, what? I want to go
I had one too. I did. We literally did have an autopsy table.
So just for perfect example, like blood splatter, something as simple as blood splatter. How can blood splatter really determine how somebody might have died, or the kind of injury or things like that? What can you get from that? So let's dive into that.
Okay, so I actually have a whole section on, and I'm going to have to correct you. It's not splatter, it's spatter.
There you go. You see, that's why you're on the show.
Now, right. So the spatter is the thing. Okay, so the splatter is, it's semantics. It's really semantics. So the splatter is kind of what happens,
right?
But the spatter is the image that it makes, or the pattern that it makes. So it is really fascinating because things like the spatter, when a blood drops, it drops at a certain velocity. So if it's a low velocity, you can tell from the way they have tails, they have bodies and tails. And so from the tail points you in the direction of where the person was going when the hit happened, or when the injury happened. And then whether it's low, medium, or high velocity impact. So like a low velocity is going to be somebody bludgeoning you with a hammer or a crowbar. A high velocity is going to be gunshot wound. And so the spatter is going to look different. It's going to, it's just going to look different depending on what kind of velocity. And so that alone can tell you a lot about how an incident happened, where an incident happened. There's this thing called arterial wave pattern in blood spatter. So if a person is still living and they're moving, like say they get hit, they get injured, they get shot, and it's in an artery, but they're still trying to get away or move, because the heart is beating, the blood is coming out in that that rhythm. And so and it creates this wave pattern. So like I've seen pictures where you can see it like on the wall, a wave of blood. And so that person was living while they were trying to travel. Does that make sense?
Makes absolute sense. I'm fascinated.
It's crazy, right?
It's insane. Like just thinking about it's insane to think about like how the blood is pumping, and then as they're walking away, you see that can determine how long they lived for. It could determine so many things, and this is just simply off a blood spatter, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of things. Well, let me ask you, like, what is the biggest mistakes you see in crime dramas?
Listen, I have a whole lecture on this, and I want to preface this by saying there are reasons why mistakes, or I call them fabrications, are created, obviously. And a lot of them have to do with just the condensing of time. So we were talking about DNA, or you were mentioning DNA. One of the biggest things content creators have to do, because we only get maybe 44 minutes to tell a story or an hour and a half to tell a story. So we can't, in real life, it's going to take 6 to 12 weeks for a DNA result to come back to the lab. If it's not backed up, rape kits are backed up years, for instance. Yeah. So we don't have 6 to 8 or 12 weeks on a TV show to wait for that to happen. So that's one of the things that happens a lot. It's just the condensing of time, where you put a DNA sample into the lab and a half an hour later you have a result. Okay, probably not going to happen unless maybe you bribe the technician. I don't know.
Sure.
But I think it also gives us opportunity to create things in the story like that. Like, say you have an investigator who's like, I need to know this by the end of the day. So they go and they talk to the technician, and what does that conflict look like? So it gives us an opportunity to raise some conflict in the story. I think these are things we can use. So
are there other mistakes specifically, not just like condensings of time, like mistakes, like when something you should avoid?
Should avoid. There are so many. There are so many. I always like to start from the position of try to speak it well. Learn forensics enough that you can speak it well, because you don't have to make these mistakes. I'm trying to think of one. There's very much shades of gray, a lot of them. Some of it has to do with in the process of the protocol of processing a crime scene or the protocol of getting evidence. So sometimes you'll see maybe investigators go back to the scene and they'll find a piece of evidence or see something in that scene that they didn't notice before that then they use to try to solve the crime. Okay, great. You can do that, but that piece of evidence you find after the crime scene is shut down is totally not going to be admissible in court. That crime scene is done and over. It's been trampled on by 100 people. There's no way anything you find there is you can't use that evidence that you find after you open up the crime scene. So I see that happen a lot. And I'm like, where they maybe go back to the location where the person died.
Well, it happens all the time.
They find a bracelet or I don't know.
Sure.
Well, I get what you're doing for the story,
sure,
but that would never even be considered good evidence.
So let me ask you though, and because I think the audiences for the films that are made today and TV shows are made today, we are so savvy. We are so educated in the sense of the way things are done, where things you can get away with in the 70s or the 80s, you couldn't even begin to try to get away with now. It's just we're too sophisticated as an audience because we've just consumed so much of specifically of this kind of content, but of a lot of different things, even bad visual effects. You could I have my wife who's not even in the business. She's like, oh, that's a bad green screen. I'm like, what? How do you know that? She's like, look at it. The comp is really bad. I'm like, oh Jesus, you've been listening to me too much. So there's so many things that's so difficult for us to get past as writers. Now you have to really know your stuff. there's somebody out there listening right now saying, well, you know what? Why do I need to know about forensic speak? Like it really, it's all about the story. It's really all about, these are detail. This is minutia that really isn't as important as the character development or the this or the that. So how would you like argue to the sense, and I know my answer to that, but why would you argue that to like, well, look, you know, this is why this is kind of important. And it doesn't have to be exact because we're telling a story.
Right.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show. But I want to hear what you say, and then if it's the same as I say, I'll just say agree. Yeah. If not, I'll have my answer.
I want to hear what you have to say too. That's a great question, and I believe I'm a writer. I write film, I write TV, I write novels. I believe first and foremost, we are here to tell a great story and to entertain, and that is primarily done through character, not necessarily plotting. Plotting is important, of course, structure, plotting, very important. But what I think some of my favorite crime shows, excuse me, are the ones where the character is completely informed. The character's motivations and all that are completely informed by the investigation that they're doing. So not only are they just uncovering a crime scene and investigating it and finding justice. That's wonderful. That's a good structure. But it's how is it informing their motivations, their wounds, their strengths? How is it playing to their strengths? How is it really digging at their wounds? How is it changing them as a person? Mm-hmm. So I think that's like, first you have to get the base level right. I always say, I love writing crime drama because it's very left brain and right brain. You have to get the trails of evidence absolutely locked tight. You have to get the plotting locked tight. You have to get that structure. But then on top of that, you have to get you have to work in this amazing story about a character who really goes from A to Z, right? Who makes this 180 arc. And the thing that's doing that for that character is the crime that they're investigating, the people that they're meeting, the victim's families, the suspects. Those are all working to change them, to transform them, to test them, to provide obstacles. So that's my answer to it, I guess. So you need to know, you need to be authentic in your crime plotting, and crime plotting has to do with trails of evidence, and trails of evidence have to do with forensic evidence.
My answer to this is a little bit different, but I think it's agreed if anyone even cares. But my point of view of forensics or that kind of details, you look at a film like Titanic, which, you know, Jimmy Cameron went a little crazy on that film as far as authenticity is concerned, but there is an underlining feeling that the audience can feel when things are authentic. And with forensics, it's even more so. Like, I literally know that he used like the napkins that were on the tables were manufactured by the company that did the napkins 75 years, 100 years ago when they first did it. Like, would you notice that? No. Would I notice that? No. But everybody else on the crew did notice that. Everyone in the crew felt that. The actors felt it, and that came right off the screen because you can. And I feel the same thing with forensics. Like, if I write a scene that's forensic based, and all I'm going to use is my pre-knowledge of all the shows I've written, I could probably write something that's somewhat acceptable, but will not pass the smell test. It just won't pass. It won't pass the smell test, you know, as opposed to something that you might write, or someone who has you or read this book or have you as a consultant, where like perfect splatter. Like, I thought I was splatter, not spatter. Like these kind of details, but you do feel it, and I think that's why it's so important to understand the language in whatever genre you're talking. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, I love that analogy. Yeah. Yeah, right. You're right. I love that. That's really cool because it's it's like infused then, and when the actors, everybody on set, it's infused in it. And
like ER. I mean, like, or any of these medical shows, like there's stuff that they get spurted out there that nobody knows what it means, but it's authentic. And I think we're now as an audience, expecting that.
Yes.
We expect that you guys have gotten your stuff together enough to like really confuse us with this technical talk, but it makes us feel like we're actually there. Does that make sense as well?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I've actually had it work against me a few times where I'll get feedback from, I think it happened more with my novels rather than my scripts, where I got feedback from the editor that was like, yeah, I don't really think this is how it happens. And I'm like, no, it's exactly how it happens. But because we're so used to seeing things that aren't correct.
Right.
It's the CSI effect, you know, where they're like.
Was CSI the first show that actually really took it seriously? Like the forensics? Because that's the first time forensics became a thing for me.
Yeah.
Like CSI was the first thing.
I mean, you know, there was like Homicide, Life on the Street. There were cop shows. I mean, cop shows have been a staple since the 50s. But forensics, because that's the first time, people were actually like, oh, what? There's a science. How do they do that? How do you figure that out? Because I know when I, even growing up, I was kind of embarrassed about what my father did, because when I would tell them, oh, he's a medical examiner, I would get these looks like, I don't know what that is. And I'd be like, well, you know, he does autopsies, he investigates deaths. And I would get these looks, I don't know what that is. Like
but he would be on the crime scene. He would be on the crime scene.
Yeah, he would. No, he would absolutely.
So would he be a crime scene investigator, like as well, or would he be a medical examiner? Or is there a difference?
There is a difference. So in our county, there's a coroner medical examiner system. So, and it's a smaller county. So whenever something happened, you know, a death, and not all of them were criminal, obviously, but he would go out and he would take his own set of pictures. He would do his own investigation. Nobody could touch the body until he was done doing his examination first.
Which we see a lot on these CSI kind of scenarios. You always see a guy there or a girl there taking pictures. You can't touch the body until she's done. Yeah. Kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so because there was nobody else to do it, you know, the detectives did their thing as well, but he had to do his investigation because he was the coroner, the medical examiner, the death investigator. He was everybody. He was everything. So he would do everything. And then once he was satisfied, then they would finish up their investigation and examination of the scene, and then they would bring the body to the morgue, and then he could do the examination of the body. Now in Los Angeles, for instance, we have a coroner medical examiner system. So the medical examiners stay at the county morgue. They never leave the basement. They never leave the morgue. All they do, they're just like churning out autopsies. Boom, boom, boom.
Sad, but true.
Yes, sad, but true. Sad, but true. So they only examine the body. But then we have coroners in LA who go out, and coroner investigators who go to the scene, and they do their own pictures and then, you know, take temperature of the body and investigations. So it really depends where you're at, what system.
Now, in your opinion, what is the best show and the best film ever that has this kind of like forensic authenticity?
Gosh, there's so many. Let's see. Show-wise, wow.
And I mean, I imagine CSI is pretty
hard.
dark.
I mean, yeah. I mean, they do a really good job. They cover. I mean, obviously, they go beyond what is possible.
Of course.
And their labs look amazing. And I don't think any lab in the United States really looks like that. Even in New York or LA, it does not happen. Right. But they, you know, I do think they have done a great job of exposing the science of what, and the depth and intricacy of the science, and how it's changing and evolving, and we're getting better at it.
How about movies? Are there any movies that you just like when you saw?
You know, forensically, gosh, I have to say one of my favorite movies investigatively is Prisoners.
Oh God, yeah, I remember that movie.
Yeah, because the truth of the matter, and the thing is, when I've broken down that movie extensively, and in terms of evidence trails, and when you follow the evidence trails, I think there is only one piece of physical evidence, in one or two, in that entire case, because I look at it also as cases, the rest is all circumstantial or direct evidence. And I think I love this movie so much because that is actually how it usually happens. Most cases are tried off of circumstantial evidence, or maybe direct evidence. It's actually a lot more challenging to find admissible physical evidence than what we see on television. So forensically, I think that's a pretty accurate depiction of how cases are more typically investigated through kind of detective work and talking to people and putting together inferences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, with characters, I think this is a great thing that we could talk about too, just to help the writing. If you create a crime and you create that evidence trail, that's kind of like plotting, and you're kind of outlining the story. So if you know a lot about this process, just doing a normal forensics, situation kind of helps you write the story. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
100%. When I start a new project, I always pretend like I'm the detective or I'm the investigator, and I create a case file, and I start laying out like, okay, this is what I think is going to happen with the murder. And I start laying out what are the trails of evidence to get there. Even if I never use all of them or I don't use everything, I pretend like I build the entire case first, and that becomes my structure. That becomes my foundation.
It makes writing a little bit easier almost if you're going down this road.
Yes.
One of my favorite shows, and it's not specifically forensics, but there was a lot of forensics in it, was Bones.
Oh yeah.
I loved Bones. And my wife and
That's a good show.
We just found it like a year ago, and we just ate through the entire 12 seasons, just binged it over 6 months. Anytime we didn't, and it was just, and you're sitting there going, how is she finding out like this information from the bone? Like you can actually see where the hatchet hit and what kind of blunt instrument and all that I'm assuming is true. Yeah. That's like a sub field within this in this world, right?
Yeah, forensic anthropology is a completely different subfield where you're really just bones. Have no tissue. Yeah, you just have bones. So it's very fascinating and ways to figure out the ages of the bones and the sex and gender and height and all that. Yeah,
all based on just bones. It was such a good show. Such a good show.
Yeah, it was.
Now, I'm sure you've been asked this question a bunch of times because you're in forensics. OJ, what happened?
Do you know we actually studied that case?
I'm sure you and many others.
Yes, in the Forensics Academy, and we had a guest come in who had worked that case.
Okay.
That's actually such a pivotal, and it was just the anniversary of this. Did you?
Yeah, because OJ has
25 years or something.
Yes, and I just found out that OJ has a Twitter account, and I just was I mean, he was like, "Hey guys, I got some payback to do, so I'll get ready to hear what I have to say." And you're like, you don't want OJ to say he's got payback. That's just not so brutal. So what happened with that case? Because we all know he did it. So
we do.
It's such a failure of the complete justice system. But anyway.
It is. You know what? It's a failure of forensics first. Mm-hmm. And that case actually was pivotal and was like a turning point. And they teach it for this reason in the way that we handle and process evidence. Because I know this is hard to believe, because we think we're so advanced and things are advancing so fast. But 25 years ago, it was very common and not unusual for a detective to just slide a vial of blood in his pocket. It's 3 a.m. I'm going to run home, get 3 hours of sleep, and then I'll bring it to the office. That was common. That was normal. And I mean, I remember times even like where my dad would be investigating a crime, or not even a crime, a death, late into the night. It's 4 a.m. He's tired. There's snow all over the roads. It's snowing. It's another 10 miles to the morgue. He's just going to pull the car into the garage, sleep for a couple hours, and then in the morning, 2-3 hours later, he'll bring it to the morgue.
And he just leave it in the car.
Leave it in the car. Lock the door, lock the garage. It's just us. but you can't do that anymore. I mean, that's kind of how things were done back then. So that's basically what happened with the OJ case. They weren't trying to be, they wanted to prosecute this. Obviously they wanted to do the best they could, but that was just a normal procedure. And it just,
the other side's attorneys, OJ's attorneys, just ripped them apart.
Yeah.
Just tore
exactly. Then you have a huge hole. You have this huge break in the chain of evidence, and boom, you're done. It's not admissible anymore. So.
And they just, I mean, it's a master class. I mean, Crocker it's a master class to watch how you can literally just but there was so much. He was the chef, but there was so much meat out there. I'm not sure if that's a good analogy or not in this situation, but he cooked them. I mean, and I was one of the guys, and I don't know how old was, what year was that? It was 25 years ago?
90.
Yeah. So I was just out of, I was just out of high school, and we all watched it like every,
we did too.
It was the best reality show on television. You just turn it on and like, oh, there it is again. And oh, there it is again. Or you hear the updates of what happened. It was insane time.
I know. Don't they say that it's kind of the start of reality television too?
It kind of, I mean, arguably the start of reality shows were The Real World, which was on MTV.
Uh-huh.
That was the first, that kind of reality show. But this was like our obsession of like what a reality show. It's cinema verite. It's what it is. It's cinema verite watching that court case. Yeah. But I became, and so many people started becoming like forensic experts by watching that because there was so much speak.
Right.
When did CSI come out? That must have come out really soon after. Late 90s.
Yeah. So it was 99. Yeah.
That came out after because it was because forensics played such a part in that case. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, it's such a
things. I mean, really, policies and procedures really changed. First of all, in LA, and then just kind of spread throughout the county or the country. Yeah. So
now, what types of evidence are there? Because you kind of mentioned a few of them. Like there are specific kinds of evidence, and I always thought it was like circumstantial and physical. Those are the two that I know of from watching shows. Mm-hmm. What other kind of evidence is there?
Sure. So, I mean, you have physical evidence, and you can break that into trace evidence, biological evidence, impression evidence.
What's impression?
Impression is like you walk through sand and
footprint.
Yeah.
Right.
Or somebody, hits a hammer through your drywall. That's an impression.
Sure.
And then you have direct evidence, which is really your video feeds, your photos, anything, eyewitness testimony, anything that directly shows that thing going on, which we have so much of that now.
I mean, it's Big Brother. It's 1984. Yeah. I mean, everybody's watching everything. But so in the Rodney King court case, that video that the guy took of the beating would be considered what kind of evidence?
Direct evidence.
That's direct evidence.
Direct evidence.
Which meant nothing at the time.
I know.
That's a whole other. It's not your job to. It's not your job. It's not. Yeah. It's not your job to judge the evidence. You just have to present the evidence. Exactly.
Forensics is science applied to the law. All we have to do is apply the science, and then the legal system hopefully takes care of the rest.
All right. So, what other kind of evidences are there?
So what we did. We did direct, we did physical, and then there's circumstantial, which is really the gray area of evidence, and actually where I think story can live very nicely.
Okay.
Because, and it hasn't. Have you seen 7 Seconds? It's a show on Netflix. It's a limited series on Netflix. It's a crime series set in New York City. So much circumstantial evidence. So it's all about, you look at what happened and you try to piece together like a dotted line. So it's like if somebody broke into your studio, you weren't there, and let's say you leave your studio, everything's perfect the way it is. You got your nice stools and your pillows
and my Yoda.
Yes, Yoda, everything's perfect, right? Your pictures. You leave for 2 hours, go to the Trader Joe's, you come back, your stools are tossed across the room, your pictures are off the wall and broken, your Yodas are all smashed up or maybe missing. Maybe your Yodas are missing and your equipment's missing. What can you assume happened? while you were gone?
That someone broke in. And generally speaking, someone broke in and was searching for something, or actually there was some theft involved. That's one case scenario. Another case scenario is an ex-girlfriend from 30 years ago has found me and just wants to ruin my life.
Exactly.
I don't have one of those, but just, so for this case, for the state of the podcast.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show.
My uncle came home and he was drunk. Like I don't have a drunk uncle, but that's another. So there's many scenarios, but the first place you go to was foul play or someone tried to break in and steal, right?
Right. I mean, another option is you got drugged, you came home and you did it yourself, and then you woke up and, I mean, there's so many.
There's thousands.
There's thousands of great story options, but the point is you look at what happened and you say, what are the circumstances that are possible in here? And then you start to talk to people like, okay, so did you have an ex-girlfriend? Did you have a drunk uncle? Did somebody drug your drink while you were in the Trader Joe's? I mean, all these.
The little coffee.
Exactly.
That free coffee you get at Trader Joe's.
It really wasn't creamer.
Brutal. I'll never drink Trader Joe's coffee again.
What is in the agave syrup?
We're writing shows right here as we speak. We're literally writing shows. The Trader Joe's shows.
It was murder. Yeah, the Trader Joe's.
Jeez, that's insane.
So circumstantial is where you're looking at the things that happen and trying to piece together a dotted line that leads to the truth. So.
And that's basically why there's so much of that in cinema and in television, because of and even also in novels and things like that, because that's where it's a gray area. So you really like literally you threw a scenario. I threw out 3 possible scenarios, and you could have started and we could have literally had 20 or 30. Yeah. Oh, it's the ex-girlfriend. Oh, it was the daughter. Oh, it was the butler that did it with the candlestick. Exactly. So there's so many, but then forensics would come into that scenario, and then like, okay, let's see what evidence has been left behind. So maybe there's some blood left over, or some sweat, or things like that from, and then like, who has access to this place? Oh, okay, well, it's this and that.
Exactly.
I'm speaking purely from watching shows for the last 20 odd years. That's how I'm even able to even have this conversation with you. It's purely from watching so many of these shows. Just like, well, there's this and there's this option, and then this could happen, and this. It's funny, like, but seriously, like, you're like a forensic specialist, and I'm literally having a conversation. I'm not by any stretch am I an expert, but at least I could have a conversation with you. Like, oh well. DNA, it could have been blood, it could have been sweat, it could have been spit, a hair follicle could have been left behind.
Soil from the shoe, maybe somebody's shoe left a piece of dirt.
Yeah, and where is that soil? Well, it's what is it from? I see Beverly Hills Cop 2. Like, the shoes, they have mud on it. Where's the mud from? The oil fields. Well, he used to jog over at the oil fields. That's where he's at, and all these things. Yeah. And this is like literally decades of information that gets flown into your head as a writer of all these shows and all these experiences that you start throwing in there. It is fascinating, and it's really fun.
Fascinating.
It is fun to write this stuff.
Right. And what you just did with that's okay. That's how we do it. We're storytellers. And so what you just did with the shoe to the jogging to the oil, that's physical evidence, physical trace evidence, and you made a circumstantial jump to the oil fields. That's perfect. That's now you're building a trail of evidence. That's awesome.
Right. Exactly. That was literally the plot of Beverly Hills Cop 2. Yeah. I never forgot that. Yeah. Like at the bottom of the shoe, there's this kind of sand. Well, where have I seen that sand before? Oh, it's over down like a block or two where the oil fields are, because there's oil in it, because he jogs at the oil, and this is jogging shoes, so it must be that's where he is, and that's where the bad guys were. So
exactly.
but that's how you construct a story like this. It's really, really fascinating.
And now, see how Beverly Hills Cop, right? Yeah.
Beverly Hills Cop 2, yeah.
Beverly Hills Cop 2. That's a comedy, but it's a crime.
No, of course. It's a detective story.
Right.
It's a detective story.
Yeah. So people think that detective stories are just this one thing, but there's actually like I have a whole lecture on, there's like 11 types of crime stories, and one of them is comedic.
So can you give us a few examples of those kind of crime stories? Because everyone thinks of CSI. Everyone thinks of homicide or Law and Order and that kind of stuff, which is obvious.
Absolutely. Okay. There's the first one, Beverly Hills Cop 2. But then another one, I loved this show when it was on Pushing Daisies.
Yeah, we are great. It was a great show. Yeah.
It's so sad it went away. You have Monk.
Monk was so good.
So good. Comedic. Oh goodness! Of course, now that you ask, I'm like totally blanking on all these.
Right. Bones.
Bones has some humor. Psych has a lot of humor. They're even Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is like one of my favorite shows right now. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a forensic comedy. It's a detective cop comedy,
right? And
they solve cases every episode,
right? In a funny, ridiculous way. Yes.
And so with these, obviously the forensics doesn't have to be as Loctite, because that's not the point. You're not watching it for the, how did they get the killer?
But there still has to be some basic understanding of forensics, because the audience is so well educated and so sophisticated that if they, even in a comedy, there's some basic things like DNA. You can only do so much with DNA, and you can't go too far off the reservation. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And if you were to just break down an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine purely just for plot and for the detective elements, the trails of evidence, it would work. It would totally work. Every single episode. So there, so it's like the character, the plot, left brain, right brain.
And that's great. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people, again, only think of like CSI, think of those kind of shows for this kind of stuff, but it is everywhere. And it's anytime there's a detective story, anytime there's a cop story, there's always forensic, even if like Beverly Hills Cop, for a perfect example, or even just fun, stupid comedies. There's still always some sort of forensics involved, or evidence-based stuff involved. Now let's talk DNA, because DNA is a very broad term. And what is the truth about DNA? What can we really truly get out of DNA in today's world? And how long has DNA been around? Has it been like 30 years, 40 years, 50 years?
Okay. So I love studying DNA. I mean, the first sort of inklings of genomes and all that were back in the 50s. But truthfully, the first case that used DNA legitimately in a court to solve a case was in England, and it was 1988. And so you did not see DNA really start to become widespread use in a courtroom until probably the mid to late 90s.
So that's kind of like exactly when OJ happened. Yeah. So it was in its infancy, basically. DNA was in its infancy.
Yeah. And at that time, too, it was difficult to test it because you needed larger quantities of it. There were limited testing.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's evolving so much. I just wrote 2 newsletter articles in my newsletter about DNA. And the last one's all about kind of the different things that are evolving in DNA right now. DNA research, like they're starting to do research and develop tests where you could actually it's not really DNA. It's considered more of like a chemical compound that can determine if you're male or female, because DNA doesn't determine that. It can't determine male or female. You can do Y-DNA tests, which determine male, but you have to know first that it was a male. So it's a little tricky. So it's constantly evolving. It's constantly getting better. But for instance, this is a fascinating statistic I learned recently, and sad, actually. So there are over 400,000 rape kits sitting in labs all over the country.
Yeah, what's his name? Last week tonight, John Oliver did like
I love that.
25-minute just rant on rape kits. It's insane that's
brutal.
Yeah.
No, and he did one before that on Death Investigation, which was hilarious and also very true, by the way.
Yes.
Anyways, I think something like only 0.2% of those kits, let's just say right now, whatever's getting tested, only 0.2% of those cases of those kids are actually solved based on DNA.
Wow.
That's
And you would think that has the best option of actually using the DNA to solve a case.
This just illustrates the point that most times either DNA isn't available at the scene, or it's partial DNA. They can't get a full reading, or it's degraded. It's just not what we think it is based on television. It's good. It's wonderful. It's getting better, but also it's expensive. And so another thing people don't realize is that when an investigator investigates a scene, DNA is not necessarily the first thing that they go test. Like if they have certain things that they're testing, because it's expensive. So they'll try other tests first, a lot of times, test on, I don't know, fibers and shoe prints and things like that. They'll send those off to the lab first because they're cheaper, they're easier to get. And then the DNA tests, again, it takes 6 to 12 weeks to get those back. Sometimes it's backlogged. They're expensive. And you were talking about police budgets and investigative budgets across the country that are constantly being challenged, and there's not enough money to do things that really need to be done. And I mean, and there's not enough technicians to be tested. That's another big problem. There's not enough labs and not enough technicians trained to test all of this, on top of funding resources being a bit scarce too. So yeah, we need some reform in that area.
Just talking to you in this episode, I mean, there's being a storyteller and a writer myself, it just seems that there is endless amounts of just ripe story ideas in forensics, just to create. Literally just having conversations with you right now, I've had 5 or 6 different story ideas, we could do this, and we could do this detective story here, and that's basically what TV shows are. Like there's just this one every week. That's why you could do 3,000, 5,000 episodes of CSI in multiple states, in multiple different genres. There's just so much to be mined. So as a beginning writer, if any writers are out there who are beginning, this is possibly a really nice niche to walk into without question. And if you know your stuff and you can actually write really well in this niche, chances of you getting hired at a show or streaming service becomes a lot better. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would hope that would be true.
Well, in the magical world, of course.
Yes, exactly.
Now, also, I wanted to ask you really quickly, any advice on how to make a courtroom scene a bit more realistic? Because I've loved courtroom dramas.
Me too.
A good courtroom drama, like a few Good Men.
Oh, so good.
So like The Verdict, all these amazing courtroom dramas. What can we do to make those a little bit more realistic?
Okay. Well, I do have a section in Forensic Speak on courtroom talk, because you should be able to understand, because I know I wasn't even complete when I started diving into this. I knew a lot about death investigation, but I was like, what does happen in a courtroom? So I started to really talk to judges, talk to attorneys. I've sat in on murder trials before, and I love it. I love doing it. So I think that's a really good way for a writer. Just spend a couple days sitting in on a trial, on a criminal trial or civil. I mean, I think criminal ones are a little more interesting. Now, they're not the most exciting things in the world, but you get to understand how the process works and who asks what and what they can ask or can't ask. That's probably the best advice I have, is just to experience it. And then if you know people who are criminal trial attorneys or judges or whatever, talk to them. I sat down and talked with the judge and asked, and she was just so gracious, asking me, as I asked a bunch of questions about, what does this really mean? And why isn't this thing admissible? And how does the process work?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised that attorneys and judges, they're not often asked to be interviewed. So if you ask them like, hey, I'm a writer, I'd love to talk to you and kind of pick your brain about your process, man, that's a very high likelihood that they're going to say yes.
Yeah. Especially the retired ones, because they want to talk and share. And
Exactly. Now, tell me about your book. I mean, we've been talking about your book a lot in this episode, but tell me a little bit more about your book and where can people find it, and then where can people find you and your other work as well?
Sure. Okay, so it's Forensic Speak. It's over 300 terms on forensics. It is a forensic boot camp in a book. And you can find everything super easy on my website, jenniferdornbush.com. You can find links there to purchase it, and that you can find my blog, all kinds of information. There's some free videos on crime writing there as well.
Okay.
And yeah, so jenniferdornbush.com will be I also have Twitter and Facebook, and you'll find those links too. And so I like to just talk a lot about forensics on my Forensic Speak Facebook page. So I'll put a lot of just fun facts and, things that I run across. So.
And then don't you have a book coming out too, the sequel to The Coroner?
Oh yeah. So this is a novel that came out last year, and the sequel comes out January 2020.
Nice.
So yeah, and we're actually pitching this as a TV series. So
as you should. You should. Listen, there's so many streaming services out there. There's so many shows out there. I mean, come on. Someone could finance this and get it out on the street. Someone.
Yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. What advice would you give a screenwriter wanting to break into the business today?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's such a great question, because the business is so different than when we tried to break in.
Very much so.
I think it's so much friendlier, honestly.
There's a lot more opportunity now than there was before, but there's also a lot more competition.
There's a lot of competition. There will always be competition, because what we do is unique and special, and people want to be a part of it. So that's amazing. My path has been so odd in trying to break into this world.
So get born into a forensic family.
Yes. So if you could just, get born into a forensic family, that's the first step. Now, I have no magic beans on this. It's been so much hard work and perseverance, and honestly, just never quitting. Never quitting. Find that circle of support, because you need it. You need that support along the way. Just keep challenging yourself in your craft. I'm not a natural networker, but I had to learn. And so now I actually love meeting new people like you. I love going out to meet new people and just keep adding to your contact list and keep in touch with people. I think the biggest thing, and I think this is a little challenging, and I don't mean to pick on millennials or Gen Zs, but I think one of the things that has gained me the most progression is that I stay in touch with people. Like I met people 12 years ago that I just put them in my contacts, and you stay in touch. You let them know what you're working on, because it's a marathon, right? As we know, it's a marathon. It's like 5 marathons, maybe even 20. I don't know. I feel I
many
ran like 5,000 miles already. So everybody knows that, and they're in it for the long run. And so just develop friendships and relationships and keep developing those. And I think they work best when they're on a personal level, not on social media. Honestly.
Fair. Yeah. A phone call, a personal in face. That's always, it's always in person is always nice.
Yeah. Just have a coffee fund, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to go out for coffee a lot. It's like,
fair enough.
Take people out for coffee, just honestly, I really think it's about building relationships and persevering. So.
Fair enough. Now, can you tell me the book that had the biggest impact on your life or career?
Goodness. Yes, I can. I mean, I love to read, so I have a bazillion books on my love book list. But I'm going to tell you, this is maybe a little shocking, but the biggest, this actually came to me this year. The book that has had the most impact and influence on my life and my career is the Bible.
Okay, fair enough. That's happened in this show before.
It's
fantastic stories.
Stories are amazing.
Fantastic stories. Sometimes brutal.
X-rated. There are X-rated stories in the Bible. People don't know.
I like the second part more than the first part. It's a little
Yep.
nicer,
Yes.
Not too much, but a little less
Yeah.
wrath. But anyway,
Yes. More about grace and mercy. Yes.
Yeah. Less blood, a little less blood, not by much, but a little less.
The crucifixion's pretty bad, but
Like I said, a little less, little less.
Yeah, maybe a
But-
few less wars. I don't know.
Okay,
But
fair enough.
I
fair enough.
honestly, yeah, because and the story that I keep going back to, because you know how they say you always continue to write about the same story model.
Sure.
For me, is the prodigal son. I find that
know. I
my
love the
work,
prodigals also.
right, like
It's a great story.
I write about that in so many different ways. Even if I'm not trying, I find I come back to those themes. So
Okay. Now,
There it is.
what is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life?
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor. And now back to the show.
I'm still learning it. Patience.
Yeah, that's mine. Patience. Yeah, patience is mine too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the universe has a way of forcing you to learn that.
Yes.
Forcing you to learn that lesson, whether you like it or not. It's
Yeah.
because no matter how much you're angry about things not happening the way you want it to at the time frame you want to, no one
It
cares.
doesn't change.
No one cares.
No.
No one cares.
No one cares.
What did you learn from your biggest failure?
Oh man. That's a good question. Biggest failure. There's been so many.
That means you've learned a lot then. That's a good thing. I always say fail and fail often.
Oh man. I guess most recently in the last, say, 2 years, my biggest failure has been, and it's, failure is a great thing, right? Because you learn, has been learning focus, because I was split in so many directions.
Scattering the energies. Yeah.
Oh, awful. And I thought I could do it all. And society tells us we can do it all. And especially as women, they're like, you can have it all. You can do it all. I'm like, well, maybe, but I don't think you do it all well when you try to have it all. So focus.
I suffer from that. Believe it. And a lot of people listening are like, Alex suffers from focus. I'm like, I focus, but I focus on a lot of things, and I do a lot. But I wish I could just focus on one thing at a time. And when I do, those small times I do actually focus on one thing, I get so much more done.
I know.
It's called Deep Work. Have you ever read that book, Deep Work?
No, I would love to.
It's a great book. It's just all about athletes and entrepreneurs and scientists and all these kind of people that kind of just what they do. It's when you go into deep work. It's a great book. It's just called Deep Work, and because we're all distracted with so many things in life, that when you can actually just turn everything off, and an hour of deep work is much more valuable than 5 hours of scattered work.
Very true.
It's very, very true. Now, what is the biggest fear you had to overcome for writing your first book, novel, screenplay?
I wrote my first screenplay in 2002. Mm-hmm. We were living in Phoenix, and I was teaching high school at the time. So I would come home after being exhausted from teaching high school all day.
Brutal.
Oh, no. And because I didn't really have time in the morning to write. And I was like, no, I'm going to write from 3 to 5. And my biggest fear was just that I wouldn't be able to do it, to get in the habit and really make it happen. Because I had came to that kind of writing later in my life. I really ran from my calling for a long time.
As we do.
Yes, as one does.
As one does.
As one does. But there's a great book called The Late Bloomers that I'm wanting to read. Maybe you've heard about this.
I haven't heard that one, no.
I'm embracing that. But
yes.
I was just so fearful that I wouldn't be able to be disciplined enough to actually do what I knew I was supposed to do.
Fair. I trust me. I know a lot of people listening right now are in the exact same boat. It's like, can I actually do this? Yeah. And if you what I always found was like, just set yourself a goal every day. And if it's 1 page a day, write 1 page a day. It could take you 5 minutes. It can take you an hour, but just write that 1 page a day. And in 90 days, you'll have a screenplay.
Exactly.
And if you're feeling froggy, 2 pages a day, and you'll have it in 45 days, and so on and so forth. And not to rewrite. Don't rewrite.
No, don't rewrite. Mm-mm.
Just keep it going and then go back later. And then now this is the toughest question of all. 3 of your favorite films of all time.
Oh my goodness. I hate these questions because I have so many. All right. Definitely Gone with the Wind.
Okay. Been on the show many times.
Yeah. I mean, I saw it at 15 and I fell in love with Scarlett. And
I saw it around 16 or 17. And I was just like, this is good. Like even then when Jean-Claude Van Damme was the greatest actor of all time for me, it still cut through. Anytime a movie can cut through in your teens and still hit you, that means it's really good.
Really good. It's funny because a lot of these are not crime related at all because people will say, oh, you must watch a lot of crime. I'm like, yeah, I do for research. But what I love to watch is comedy or lighter things. So Amelie is definitely another one. Amelie. I just turn it on. So just
gorgeous
it's
film.
Just so sweet and beautiful. And Amelie.
Got it.
Oh no, I have to pick another one. From what? Okay. All right, here's another one, and this is actually a comedy crime movie. Gross Point Blank.
Oh, so good, John Cusack.
Yes, I wish I could have written that.
Oh,
that film.
So good, good.
It's just good.
Jennifer, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. It is a very this is a morbid conversation topic, if you will, without question. Yes. But it is the realities of life and also a wonderful and very fertile ground for writers to dive into. And it has been diving into them since the late 90s, basically. Since CSI kind of showed up, people have taken this entire subgenre of writing into a whole other place. And it really can't help every genre, completely in every genre. So it does help a lot. So thank you for shedding some light into the dark places, as you like to say.
That's what I do.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
I want to thank Jennifer for coming on and shedding some light on a very dark subject matter and making it so fun and playful and wonderful, but something that is really needed, especially in the screenwriting community, to be as accurate as humanly possible because audiences today are extremely savvy and they've just seen too much for you not to be accurate on these kind of things. So again, thank you, Jennifer, so much. If you want to get links to her book or anything we discussed in this episode, please head over to indiefilmhustle.com/BPS053. And if you haven't already, please head over to screenwritingpodcast.com, subscribe to the show, and leave a good review. It really, really helps us out a lot with the rankings. Thank you again so much for listening. I hope this has been of service to you today on your screenwriting journey. As always, keep on writing, no matter what. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast at bulletproofscreenwriting.tv.